On Saturday, May 14th at 2:30 in the afternoon, the unthinkable happened in a black community in Buffalo, New York. An 18-year-old white man armed with military-style weapons and dressed in body armor entered the parking lot of the Top supermarket and began shooting. By the time police arrived and took him into custody, he had shot 13 people and killed 10, all mostly African Americans. What we learned in the aftermath of this public lynching is horrifying. Today, I talked to law enforcement experts, race scholars, and a criminal defense attorney as we seek to understand and make sense of this brutal hate crime and the lessons America refuses to learn from mass shootings. All coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
The story of the Buffalo shooting has dominated the news since Saturday, since we all learned that 10 people shopping in their local grocery store were gunned down by an 18-year-old white supremacist who had planned for months their murders, who had traveled for 200 miles to find this black supermarket, who had surveilled this black supermarket, who knew that it would be crowded on this Saturday afternoon, and who carried out his vicious, premeditated attack. In the midst of this horrific shooting, we've now heard calls for more gun laws from everybody from the president down to state and federal legislators. There are calls now for new domestic terrorist laws. But I'm asking, as someone who's been in this position many times, commenting on these kinds of mass shootings, looking at and listening to all the comments that are made by the politicians and our elected officials, and just wondering if this time will be any different than what we've seen this country do in the aftermath of so many mass shootings, from shootings at elementary schools, nightclubs, movie theaters, shopping malls. We have been here before. Starting this morning's conversation, speaking with criminal attorney, a favorite guest of the show, former homicide prosecutor, now a lawyer who's doing a lot of criminal defense work. Her name is Bernarda Villalona. Bernarda. I'm just so welcome and good morning. I'm so just emotionally, I guess, overwrought by this mass shooting. But we've been here so many times before. And I want to ask you from a criminal standpoint, tell us what the current charges are. And we know DOJ, Department of Justice, has announced that it's investigating this horrific mass shooting. What is the DOJ investigating?
Areva, I can tell you this one hits a little bit close to home because I'm a New Yorker, born and raised in Brooklyn, and this just happened in Buffalo, a couple of hours away from me. And not even that, but also Buffalo has one of the largest also state university colleges here in New York. I can tell you, Areva, what we witnessed was a racist rampage. And this individual, even though he killed 10 individuals, innocent people, and injured another 3, was apprehended without a scratch. Right now, he's being held on just one charge, that's murder in the first degree. When he was arrested, he was processed and he was arraigned on murder in the first degree. However, by Thursday, the prosecutor has to present charges in a preliminary hearing, and I assume then he will present multiple more counts of the homicide charges as well as the assault charges, but will still have to take a step further and present the final charges to a grand jury. And that's the state prosecutor. In regards to what the DOJ is doing, while they are working together, they can form separate prosecutions. The federal government, the U.S. Attorney's Office, can come in and charge this individual with hate crime that results in death. And what's more important about the federal prosecution is that the federal prosecution can lead to the death penalty. Because in New York, despite killing 10 and shooting 3, driven by hate, The most you'll get is life without the possibility of parole.
Let me ask you this, Bernarda, someone that has been a former homicide prosecutor in New York. Why is there only one murder charge when there are 10 people dead?
Well, it's just a preliminary charge just to be able to hold the person in custody. You got to think that normally investigations take place when you're dealing with homicides before there's an arrest, meaning that you already have the autopsy. The medical examiner has performed the autopsy. You have the videos. You conducted the interviews. And here, when you want to know, we know he killed those people. We know he shot those three other people that fortunately didn't die. But what we're trying to get to, the prosecutor's trying to get to, is what was in his mind, because that makes a difference between charges, because it could be murder in the second degree or it can be murder in the first degree. But either way, it's just enough to present to the judge to be like, remand this man because he is a threat to society and is facing a charge where it's life without the possibility of parole and he's a flight risk. What counts is ultimately what the grand jury indicts him with, because those are the charges that will be presented at trial.
So we know that it's racially motivated. We know that from the manifesto that was found after these murders occurred. Is there a difference in state law in New York between someone who commits murder because of racial motivation that would be considered a hate crime versus someone that commits a murder because of some belief in some kind of extreme political ideology that may then fall under domestic terrorism? Is there a domestic terrorism and hate crime statutes? Do both of those exist in the state of New York?
So lucky enough, New York is a state that has hate crime statutes. And what hate crime statute does, it enhances the sentence of anyone who commits a hate crime. But here, like I stated, he's facing life without the possibility of parole. You can't get higher than that. However, you want to hold him accountable for the actions that he did on that day. It wasn't a simple killing. It was a killing that was driven by hate. So he should be held accountable for that, which is exactly what the federal government would want to try to do with the hate crime statute and the hate crime involving in death.
What about domestic terrorism? Is there a domestic terrorism statute in New York?
So there's also terrorism component to the murder in the first degree charge here in New York. So some states have them separate, but here in New York, you actually have them separate, but as well as you have it encompassed within the murder in the first degree charge as well.
Okay, let's talk about other people that might be charged, because thank you, very clearly articulated what's going to happen probably on Thursday. You said he'll have an arraignment, so we'll hear more about those state charges. We know this federal investigation is taking place. What about his parents? We hear that the parents express remorse, but apparently they know, or at least some reporting is that they know that he had bought these weapons. The semi-automatic weapon, maybe a rifle, maybe a pistol, that he bought multiple guns. Is there any statute in the state of New York that would hold them accountable if they had knowledge that he was arming himself with these dangerous weapons?
So right now, what they're doing is that they're conducting an investigation to determine whether the parents had any role in this. Because remember, a few months prior, I think it was earlier this year, or was it the end of last year, where there was that school shooting where the parents were also prosecuted and are actually in jail right now, waiting trial on their charges, as well as the son for shooting up that school. So in terms of what we know now in regards to the parents, we don't know much. Remember, a lot of this information is not going to be given to the public because it's still an active investigation. But what I will want to know is that who purchased those guns for him? Who purchased the ammunition for him?
You're saying for him because in the state of New York, can you, at 18 years old, which is how old he is, can you purchase a semi-automatic weapon?
Well, I know that New York has one of the most difficult laws in terms of purchasing a firearm and even having a license to be able to carry in New York. Because even as being a prosecutor, or used to be a prosecutor, it was difficult even for a prosecutor to get a firearm for their own safety. So in terms of what I want to know is, again, how were these firearms purchased? Did the parents, whether the mom or the father, actually edge him on to his conspiracy theories? Were they active participants? Did they aid in this taking place to determine whether there'll be any charges? However, my question, Areva, is if you already knew that last year, less than a year ago, that your son was taken for a psychiatric evaluation because he made mention about committing murders and suicide, you were already placed on notice as to his mental state. So what did you do to try to prevent something like this from happening? That is what I want to know from those parents.
Yeah, and I'm glad you bring that up because we have learned now that last year, in response to a question during an economics class, he responded about wanting to commit murder-suicide. Apparently, authorities were alerted and he was taken to a psychiatric hospital for evaluation. He stayed a day or so, then released. And as far as we know, he had no further involvement with law enforcement. In the state of New York, when something like that happens, is there any obligation for that agency, whether it's that mental health facility where he was hospitalized, to then notify the police and then he be placed on some kind of list where he would not be allowed to carry a firearm? Does that law exist?
And so what does exist is what's called the red flag law. So you can actually have someone evaluated if you think that they are a threat to themselves or to others, which is exactly what took place in this case. However, they didn't take it a step further, whether it was the parents or law enforcement, to ask a judge to issue an order where this person would not be allowed to purchase any firearms. That is what's missing in this case. However, who's to say that even if that order were have been issued, he wouldn't have been able to get the firearm or the ammunition elsewhere? Because we're talking about, even though he had the AR-15, he also had an attachment to that AR-15 that was completely purchased separate.
So we know we've heard. So thank you about the parents. Now let's talk about this online. We know he was radicalized, according to him, online, and we've heard your governor, your governor for the state of New York, Governor Hochul, talk about responsibility. And she says she doesn't know if it's just morally or legally that these online sites, including where he was radicalized, and Twitch, where he actually tried to live stream and was able to live stream this massacre for at least 2 minutes. Is there any legal liability for the chat room where he was radicalized, or the Twitch platform that allowed it to live stream for 2 minutes?
So it's a bigger issue than that, because you got to think you're also fighting against the First Amendment, right? Freedom of speech. So you're fighting with the First Amendment and then trying to strike a balance. However, what I would say, I think it's more of a responsibility of these online platforms to figure out how to form an algorithm that will be able to stop this at its core. Because if you stop it at its core, at its root, then hopefully we will never have another incident like this. You got to think, but it's also not just from online.
When you say algorithm to stop it, these chat rooms where he was, they're set up to disseminate this racist white supremacy ideology. So what would the algorithm do? Because the very essence of the website is come on board, because you are someone who is leaning towards this ideology, and we want to give you more and more information.
Yeah, but the crazy part about it is that those same sites, though, they are trying to tread lightly in terms of not enticing someone, because even though you have a First Amendment right to freedom of speech, you cannot entice someone to commit a crime. Remember, that was a huge issue with the January 6th, where Donald Trump was said to have been enticing these people to take over Capitol Hill. So where do you stop this, Areva? That's the thing. Where do you stop it? But aside from that, how about what's going on TV? How about people that are in the press, in the media, know they have a huge following, and in my opinion, are enticing and empowering people like this white supremacist to go out and take action? What do you do with that? Is it more about money? Is it more about trying to create a bigger base for you? Or do you care about human beings and their safety?
Well, you're right, Bernarda. The issue of whether it's Donald Trump, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Mo Brooks, we can call the roll, Tucker Carlson, so many other anchors on Fox and other conservative news media who talk in this language of violence, use the language of violence, and then even those elected Republicans who turn a blind eye, those who said that the insurrectionists were tourists. Hakeem Jeffries did a great speech on Capitol during one of the sessions recently where he talked about his colleagues who called the insurrectionists tourists. There's this conflict between your First Amendment right and the Fox News hosts that say we're not disseminating this replacement theory or these racist white supremacist theory. We're just reporting on them. We're just telling you what some other people out there are talking about. We're not promoting them. We're not condoning them. But we know that in many ways they are. So that's false to begin with. But there is a very difficult issue here because of our Constitution and the constitutional rights that are provided to people. Before I let you go, let me ask you briefly about defenses. So he's going to show up, this shooter, and I refuse to call his name because he wants publicity.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
He's going to show up in court, whether it's Thursday or some day after that. And he's already, what we know from his public defender is that he's pleading not guilty. Do you expect that to be his continued response? And what defenses, if any, will he have?
Well, the one aspect that I'm very curious about is whether the defense attorney on Thursday is going to ask for him to be examined and say that he's not able to assist in his own defense. If he's not able to assist in his own defense, then the problem will be is that everything is going to be put on hold until he's able to assist in his own defense. That is different than he acted based on some kind of mental issue or mental disease and couldn't formulate the intent to know that what he was doing was wrong. So that has not been filed yet. I don't expect it to be filed anytime soon, because if a defense wants to file that, they need to make sure that they have the proper documents and the proper items to back it up when they file that as a defense for trial.
You just quickly, if there is a mental deficiency or mental health kind of defense that's going to be put forward, how does that square with the level of detail, the planning, the 180-page plus manifesto? Can a person claim that they were mentally incapable of discerning between, right and wrong at the same time, have this elaborate planning process take place?
And exactly, Areva, those pieces of evidence go strongly against this man having any type of mental defect, because how meticulous this planning took place, how meticulous to every detail, down to what underwear he was going to wear, down to the outfit he was going to wear, minute by minute play. And let's take it a step further, Areva, because remember, at one point, this man goes in with the AR-15. He sees a man on the ground, but when a man turns around and he sees he's white, what does he say? Sorry. Turns around and continues going through the supermarket and shooting people. That is a man who's well aware that what he was doing was wrong. Also, when he's confronted by police, he doesn't start shooting at the police. He doesn't start arguing with the police, so he knows who they are and what their purpose is. I'm just surprised that the police didn't shoot him, even though he was armed with an AR-15 and just shot 13 people.
Yeah, that's the sad part. We always hear captured without incident when it's a white man. We rarely hear that when it's an African American or a Latinx person that has a weapon and are confronted by police. Typically it's shoot first, ask questions later. But in this case, apparently these police took the time to talk him down. Apparently he had the gun pointed at his neck, and rather than shoot him, they talked him into putting the gun down, and they arrested him without incident. Clearly, we don't want anyone to be shot by the police. That's not what we're suggesting, but it's rather disturbing that Black people are usually killed in those same encounters with police when a white man like this one walks away, even though he's going to face horrific punishment by way of potentially death, as you said, if federal charges are filed and proven. But that part of this story is as troubling as every other part of it. But thank you so much, Bernardo, for helping us understand what's happening. We'll be watching Thursday to see what happens in that arraignment. Obviously, we'll be following what happens with the Department of Justice as their investigation continues. We want to hear more, as you said, about what these parents knew, what they should have known, and what other agencies that had any involvement with this mass murderer, let's call him what he is, what they knew and what they relayed to other agencies. So such a tragic story. Always good to see you, my friend.
All right. Thank you, Areva. Be safe.
My next guest is Professor Ari Perliger. He is a professor at the University of Massachusetts Lowell. He is one of the nation's leading experts on terrorism, and he's also the author of several books, including American Zealots, Inside Right-Wing Domestic Terrorism. Good morning and welcome back, Professor.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be back with you.
Wow. Seems like every time I'm sitting down talking with you, it's because there's been some mass shooting or some horrific incident in this country. And on Saturday, May 14th, we witnessed again the most horrific mass shooting we can imagine. This 18-year-old white man goes into this predominantly black neighborhood in Buffalo, New York, and starts shooting and doesn't stop until 13 people are shot, 10 are dead, predominantly African Americans. We're learning a lot about this shooter. One thing I wanted to ask you about, Professor, is the notion that he was radicalized online. He said during 2020, during the pandemic, he was online and he discovered these other terrorists, like this terrorist in New Zealand, like Dylan Roof. What do you make of these online sites, and how many are there?
Oh, we have an entire ecosystem of spaces, online spaces that promote both various militant, racist, anti-government ideologies, as well as provide an actual instructions and guidelines for those who wants to perpetrate these kind of attacks. So if you're looking at what he did, he basically meticulously studied previous manifestos, including the Christchurch manifestos and the Poway Synagogue manifesto and the El Paso Guy manifesto. So he actually studied very carefully the manifestos of past attackers and also studied their attacks. And in his own manifesto, he actually, as we know now, plagiarized actually many sections from those manifestos and basically created his own text. More importantly, he also provided abundance of information and instructions for those who want to imitate such attacks. He explains in a very detailed way how he purchased the weapons, the gear, how he trained, how he conducted reconnaissance in the site of the attack prior to the attack. So he both provides a lot of information about how he embraced the ideology and how he learned about all those ideological ideas online, but also he really trying to inspire others to follow his steps. He actually say very specifically in his manifesto that he wanted really to show how anyone basically can perpetrate such an attack and how everyone is basically can manifest these ideologies in actual violent action. And this is, I think, something that is so concerning because he intentionally understood the power of inspiration, and that was his objective, to inspire others to imitate his actions.
And he went further than just the manifesto. We know, Professor, he actually wore that camera on his helmet so that he could live stream, and he did live stream it for at least 2 minutes or so on this platform called Twitch. It was taken down, but it did, some people saw it, 50, 60 people actually saw it. Why is it so important for these domestic terrorists to do both things, both leave these manifestos to, as you said, inspire others, and then to try to show in real time what the attack looks like?
Because we all know that actual visualization is much stronger a propaganda tool than text. We know that visuals, different types of visuals, are much more effective and are much more quote unquote inspiring, especially for young individuals who are basically operating and attending those websites and those message boards and those online platforms. And in many ways, really, the visualization of the event accelerate his transformation into some kind of a folk hero. If you look at those individuals who became basically heroes within the circles of the extreme right, you see that are those exactly who actually were able not just to tell about their attacks, but actually provide live images of their attacks, such as the Halle synagogue shooter, the Christchurch shooters. And, even Elliot Rodgers, the famous incel who became a hero within the incel community because he was able to film his attack in California in 2014. So they understand that by taking actual visualization of their attack, it will facilitate the dissemination of their materials, but also will make them basically heroes for those communities.
You mentioned right-wing extremists, and the Anti-Defamation League counted the number of murders in the U.S. by political extremists, and they said the number is 450. And they said only 20% of those murders were done by Islamic extremists, but 75% of those 450 murders were done by right-wing extremists, 4% by left-wing extremists. Why does the right have such a violence problem? Why are these murders happening from these right-wing extremists?
Because I think they have a more significant sense of urgency that they are on the losing side, because they see, first of all, they see that our society is becoming more diverse, more heterogeneous. And for them, that's resemble, a disaster for them. They believe that it's a disaster. So they have this sense of urgency. And if you read what he wrote about the big replacement theory, they feel that all those changes in American society, not just the demographic changes, but also the cultural changes, the rise in the prominency of minority groups who are not willing to continue to be marginalized anymore. They all feel that leads to dramatic societal changes, and they feel that they need to do something to prevent that. So then they feel really that they are really running against time in this sense, and that, something needs to be done, some kind of a rebellion, some kind of extreme actions to prevent that, and in their eyes, at least, to make more white Americans aware of those allegedly threats that are rising. So I think that's why we see such an increase in the militancy. But by the way, not just in the actual frequency in terms of incidents of violence, but also in the language and the toxic language that we see among not just far-right extremists, but even more mainstream figures within the far right, which in many ways using different language or different types of language in order to try to send maybe not the exact messages, but very similar messages.
Very coded messages.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
Violence is not just murders. We should make that clear, because this violence is like what we saw the January 6th insurrection. And we've seen, as you said, this language from Republicans like Donald Trump, like Mo Brooks. There are any number of Republican political figures who have engaged in this language, and we see it played out on Fox News media pretty much nightly. Tucker Carlson has been a big promoter of the replacement theory. What do you make of this, that this kind of coded language, and sometimes not so coded, very explicit language, is coming directly from what you'd consider mainstream Republican elected officials, obviously a big media network like Fox and its biggest host, and then you have the Republicans like Kevin McCarthy, who don't use the same language but won't condone the language. Mitt Romney, Liz Cheney, those are two Republicans that have been very vocal and outspoken, but you have a whole party, Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio. We can just go down the list of Republicans who are not jumping up and down and condoning this kind of language. What do you make of that?
I think it's, in my view at least, these are exactly the dynamics that eventually will lead to increase in actual violence, because they are normalizing and legitimizing a language that makes minorities and people of color and other vulnerable groups legitimate targets. Basically, they're presenting those groups as a threat, those groups as some kind of as groups that basically undermine the security of the United States and the safety of Americans. So they basically legitimize the transformation of those groups into actual enemies. And that further plays, of course, into the increasing political polarization, into the increasing decline in civility in our political discourse. So all these things eventually feed each other. But again, the most important thing to remember is that basically when you are taking parts of society and makes them the enemy or present them as a threat, you normalize and legitimize acts against those groups. You know, we had the following day we had an attack in an Asian American, I think it was a church, right, in California. We still need to wait for more details about that, but that plays into a wider trend of increasing in anti-Asian violence also that we see in the country. So we need to be aware of how this language eventually is being perceived and transformed into actual acts of violence. And when those individuals feel that they have substantial support and legitimacy behind it, they feel almost like some kind of an avant-garde that they are attacking, but they feel that there's someone behind them and that they have legitimacy to act the way they act.
So we know, Professor, this country spends a lot of time talking about the war on terrorism, and that war on terrorism has been directed to, again, those foreign terrorists. What is being done by this U.S. government to fight this domestic terrorism that you say is on the rise and is being fueled by this language of, quote unquote, legitimate news anchors, media personalities, Republican elected officials? Is the government doing anything to address this domestic terrorism?
So I think they do. I think, first of all, I think that there's a substantial amount of resources that were transferred in the last 2 years to both to community programs that are supposed to counter hate and counter the activities of hateful groups within communities. There's also increase in education of law enforcement and practitioners and various federal agencies. I know that because I'm involved in some of those efforts, both to inform and to educate and to train law enforcement so they can deal better with the proliferation of hate crimes and this kind of social dynamics and so on. Of course, more needs to be done. And I think that, the U.S. government is a big ship. So, changing the direction of the ship takes time and we need to be patient. It's for 20 years, we focused on a very specific type or form of terrorist threat. In the last 6-7 years, we're trying to shift more and more resources to deal with domestic threats, especially threats from far-right violence. And today, I think it becomes much more closer to 50-50 than the 80-20, I guess, that it was in the past. I do think that we need to engage in more legislative efforts to provide both local governments as well as the federal government more powers to deal with the proliferation of hate online, as well as with groups and movements that actively trying to recruit and mobilize individuals, including within law enforcement and within the military. And of course, we have constitutional freedoms, but we need to find ways to provide more, to empower our law enforcement to deal better with these kind of threats.
So we know this shooter was on the radar because of a threat he had made to his high school. So was there enough done to investigate that and, to go further to maybe they could have been helpful in preventing this attack?
So I think this is a great point that you're raising, because it really illustrates some of the blind spots that we have. So social services were aware that this specific student has issues and he has needs and he needs to be treated, right? He provides multiple signs that he has emotional issues, that he may suffer from some kind of mental issues, that he needs to be treated and he needs to be followed. However, this kind of information was never really shared with other actors that could have actually monitored him as well, such as law enforcement, especially local law enforcement. Now, I'm not saying that his privacy should be violated or anything else, but especially if there's a specific person who talks about engaging in violence, that is being radicalized, that shows signs of unstable emotional state, we need to find a mechanism that will enable law enforcement to work with social services in order to find ways to monitor and to flag and hopefully prevent these kind of instances. For example, the fact that he was able to put his hands on actual guns is terrifying, right? So I do think that these are the kind of collaboration and cooperation that we need to develop. And again, I think that probably social services needs to be in the lead, but we do want our law enforcement to be aware if there's a bunch of kids who are associated with neo-Nazi organizations or were radicalized, so they can also be involved in monitoring and hopefully preventing these kind of attacks.
And just lastly, Professor, these sites where this shooter was radicalized, are they being monitored by governmental agencies? And if they are, what are they doing when they see a new kid, young person, young man like this who starts signing on to these sites and is, spending considerable time? Is that the kind of trigger they're looking for to say, hey, this is a red flag? We have, every time a new user, because I'm fearful, and we all are, that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of young white men with the same profile you just described, some kind of emotional issue, feeling marginalized, feeling like the world is changing around them, that too many minorities are becoming powerful. How are we, what are we doing to find the next one? Because he's out there. He's just waiting in the window.
Yeah, we're monitoring, and we are following, and we are documenting. And in some cases, I think we also, I'm talking in general, the community that's focusing on these threats, trying to identify those potential individuals that present a risk. But the fact is that it's extremely difficult. Many of those websites provide significant protections in terms of anonymity of the users. It's very difficult to monitor and to identify really many of those users. And also the numbers are staggering, and a website like Stormfront, which has more than 300,000 registered members, it's very difficult to really, with the resources that we have, to really track all those who engage in very toxic and violent language, because that's most of them in many cases. Right. So there is significant challenges. I will say that in the last few years, we're using much more advanced tools to monitor and to identify patterns that may indicate individuals who will become violent.
Well, got to leave it there. Thank you so much, Professor, for helping us, enlightening us. Yeah, 300,000 people, that's just on one site. So there literally could be millions of people who are online on these sites who are buying into this propaganda and who are planning and plotting. And it's just a question of how effective our government, our law enforcement can be to prevent these kinds of mass shootings, but really a tragedy. Thank you so much for your work again, Professor Perliger. His book is he has several books, but one is American Zealots, Inside Right-Wing Domestic Terrorism. But we'll be looking for that next book you told me about that's on misogyny and violence related to that. Very interesting topic, one that I have a lot of interest in personally, so can't wait for that book to come out and have you back to talk about it. Thanks again for your work.
Thank you for having me.
My next guest is Professor Frank Pizzella. He is a professor at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York. His work focuses on the causes of hate crimes. He also has written several books, including The Measurement of Hate Crimes in America. Good morning and welcome, Professor Pizzella. So you are, Professor, right in New York, where all of this is happening. Help us understand how far the city where we now have learned the shooter lived, how far he had to drive to get from his city to this Buffalo community where this mass shooting took place.
Well, Areva, first of all, thank you for having me. Unfortunately, we continue to see this type of violence over and over and over again. This shooter had to travel almost 200 miles. This is certainly premeditated. He scoped it out, he surveilled it, before he went there. I understand he was in the store the day before, so clearly this is one of these racially motivated kind of hate crimes that continues to happen over and over again. And what I tell my students, what I tell others in media, like, this is not new. This is not new at all. This has been going on since Reconstruction. Every time that there is some kind of movement, some sort of progress, for African Americans, you see this kind of rise in hate crimes. Think about lynching. Think about the various rebirths of the Ku Klux Klan, and especially what happened after Reconstruction. So when you think about the Dylan Roofs, the Forrest Glenn Millers, this individual, this is not new. And we don't have any sense of the scope and prevalence of this. What we call these are mission hate crimes, where there's a designated offender who clearly makes his motivation known. But from what we know, if you look at victimization surveys, there's over 200,000 hate crimes that's committed in this country every year. But yet the police only report about 8,500. So what gives? So we have no sense of the scope. What we do know is that even from the victimization surveys and from the Uniform Crime Report is that most of them are anti-Black hate crimes. And to your point earlier, you were talking about the ADL statistics. 20% of these kind of extremist hate crimes are Islamic, 75% right-wing extremists, but of those 75% right-wing extremists, 50% are anti-Black hate crimes. So what is going on in this country?
Wow, sobering statistics, and thank you, Professor, for illuminating them for us. So I was on TV myself a couple of days ago when this happened, and the mayor of Buffalo, a Black man, was saying enough is enough, expressing his outrage, saying something needed to change. And as I was talking about this in my mind, I was thinking about those little white kids in Sandy Hook who were killed. I was thinking about the kids in Florida in high school who were killed. And this country did not respond in a way to those white kids. And so I'm thinking about the visuals of the Black bodies being carried out of that store in Buffalo, and knowing what I know as a civil rights lawyer about the history of this country, that if we did not as a country respond to those little white kids, first graders, and those white kids who were in high school, what are the chances that this country responds to those Black bodies that you say have been being lynched and killed since Reconstruction? Is there any hope? And I just felt so bad for this mayor who was saying the right things as the leader of that city. But, I know he's not naive, but he's hopeful as he should be. But based on your studies, is there any hope? We know Biden is talking about going to Buffalo, calling for gun control regulations as it relates to these ghost guns. We know some liberals are talking about domestic terror laws being enacted. But do you see any changes that are likely to come from this Buffalo mass shooting?
Not from what I can see, to be perfectly honest with you. We get a lot of rhetoric. There is differential treatment depending on the race of the victim. Over and over again, we see this. I mean, the truth of the matter is that there's been an uptick in hate crimes since 2016, since 5 was elected. The racist white supremacists are now very much emboldened. I can remember a time when it was not politically correct to be racist. Now, everybody is willing to state what their views. You talked about Tucker Carlson on Fox News, talking about, this idea of replacement theory. So there's a very real concern about whether people of color are going to be taking over this country. And this is certainly a reaction. Just think about, suppose that the offender had been Black. What would have been the treatment? Would they have talked him down and say, take your gun off your neck? Or would they have just shot him? We know the answer to that. Mm-hmm. My friends and my colleagues and my students ask me, what if Black people had invaded the Capitol? What would that outcome have been? So the short answer is there's differential treatment. And as I tell my other friends in the media, keep my number, because I think we're going to be continuing to talk, for a long time. We do have the Matthew Shepard, James Berry Jr. Hate Crime Prevention Act that expanded the jurisdiction of the federal government to be able to look at cases that doesn't involve the actual federal government. But the truth of the matter is that they're somewhat handcuffed, even in the federal government.
We know that statistically, Professor, prosecuting, incarcerating, those aren't deterrents. So that process of catching someone after a crime has been committed and then prosecuting them and incarcerating them even for their entirety of their lives is not a deterrent. So where you sit, having studied racially motivated crimes, what is it that we should be doing as a country? You said there are 200,000 of these racially motivated crimes committed every year, even though they're not being reported.
Right.
And we know that Dylan Roof was caught. He's been charged with a hate crime. He's been charged with domestic terrorism. That didn't deter this shooter. That encouraged him. Right. So far from being deterred by prosecution, these radical thinkers are being encouraged. So what is it? And this is a big question, and I know it doesn't have a simple answer, but if we had to start trying a better approach, because the prosecution and throwing these white supremacists in jail for life, that ain't stopping none of them. That's just making them heroes and causing others to want to be like them.
Areva, I think we have to put them back in the closet. I was participated on a national committee to enhance the response to hate crimes with the law enforcement for civil rights under law and the International Association of Chiefs of Police. And we formed several recommendations. And one of those recommendations is to get communities involved, to make sure, using things like social networks, use billboards to say, hate is not going to be tolerated here. That these people they've got to be overwhelmed, by the sentiments against this kind of infraction. And unfortunately, as I said, since 2016, they are very much emboldened. I'm inspired when I walk around New York, and sometimes I see on these stores is that everybody is invited here. Hate is not tolerated here. And then you see it in numerous languages. That's more inclusive. We need to send out signals and languages and messages of inclusivity. Mm-hmm. And so, I think at the end of the day, we've got to teach students about history. Think about what's happening with the opposition against teaching about critical race theory.
Well, that's why I want to bring in Dr. Tyrone Howard, because he is a UCLA professor, and his work, his research, the work that he does is in the educational realm. He studies and focuses on culture, access, and education. Good morning, Dr. Howard. You are also the author of multiple books, including Why Race and Culture Matter in Schools. This is your lane. So help us understand from an education standpoint, what are we getting wrong? We need your sound, Dr. Howard.
First and foremost, thank you, Areva, for having me for this important conversation. I can't say how valuable this platform is. I think we're missing a number of things here. I think that, number one, if you observed over the last couple of years, there's been this major, and I do mean major, outrage, anger, uproar from a lot of parents, most of them white, about critical race theory. Now, never mind the fact that the majority of them have never read anything that is about critical race theory, couldn't tell you much about the origins of critical race theory, the goals and aims of critical race theory, but somehow the narrative became that we are teaching critical race theory to elementary school students, and part of that means we're teaching white kids to feel bad about being white. And there are all these parents who don't want their children to feel bad about being white, but they don't want to hear messages about the fact that this country is inherently racist. And there have been 28 states that have either proposed or passed legislation, not just banning the teaching of critical race theory, but also banning the discussion around topics tied to race and or racism. So how do you discuss slavery? How do you discuss immigration? How do you talk about the civil rights movement? How do you talk about current issues in our society without the ability to talk about race? So on the one hand, you have folks who've been up in arms, don't teach white kids that they should feel bad being white. But on the flip side here, with this whole notion of the great replacement theory, it essentially demonizes Black folks and other folks of color to say you are a problem. You are trying to replace us. You are trying to somehow demonize our country. And I don't see anywhere close to the kind of furor or the same kind of outrage of folks showing up in mass at school board meetings to say that has no place in our schools. If you feel bad about white children feeling bad, how do you feel about Black and brown children feeling bad when there's a replacement theory that suggests that they are the problem? So there's an inherent contradiction that I think is steeped in white supremacy. It's okay for Black children and other children to feel bad about who they are, but don't you dare think for a second you're going to have white children feel bad about who they are. So what we're getting wrong is that this is the way white supremacy works. Let's be frank. Our schools oftentimes are places in which tenets of white supremacy are alive and well and promote this. And I think what we're getting wrong is that we have to push back on the legislation that's trying to suppress any conversation, teaching, or instruction about issues tied to race and racism, because great replacement theory is exhibit A of why we have to have these conversations.
And Professor Pizzella, the replacement theory that Dr. Howard is talking about was a part of this manifesto that this shooter left. And he obviously bought into this theory. How frequently in these kinds of hate crimes where manifestos are left do we see someone like this shooter lay out in great detail what's motivating them to take action?
It's interesting that, that you should ask that question, because we see it quite frequently. We saw it with Dylan Roof. We saw it historically, again, after Reconstruction, after the passing of the 13th, the 14th, and 15th Amendment, every time that there's some kind of progress, comes forward for people of color, you get this kind of reaction. Why? Because of getting more rights, it has implications of replacement theory. Even the language of the third in charge GOP, Elise Stefanik, talks about Democrats want to let people in, want to let immigrants in so they can vote. So they can vote, and essentially what she's really talking about in a very kind of subtle kind of way is replacement theory again. So we see this in the language of these extremists, but we also see it in the language of these politicians. And to your point, other politicians don't stand up and they don't stamp it out. They don't speak out against it, but for somebody like Elizabeth Cheney.
Yeah, obviously she's been very vocal about Elizabeth Cheney. And Professor Howard, Bill Barr, who was the top law enforcement agent in this country, did an interview and said there is no systemic racism. So if we have people like him, and he didn't say that on Fox, he said that on let's call it a mainstream network news program. So if he says that with such confidence and sincerity, presumably, how is it that any white family that has not had the benefit of learning history in school because it's been banned, how are they supposed to think any differently? If Bill Barr, a guy who you don't really think of as being a part of this extreme right wing, although he has tendencies like them, but he was kind of a down the middle kind of guy for a long time. But if he now is saying that, where does that leave a white family that's confused about this?
Yeah, I think it really gets to the heart of what white privilege is all about. Because, see, if we understand white privilege, what it does, it puts blinders on those who are benefactors of that very privilege. So someone like Bill Barr, any other, white family for the most part, you live in a society that constantly tells you that being white is normal, being white is human, being white is American, that this is a country that stresses that if you pull yourself up by your bootstraps, anything is possible. It tells you that we live in a very, what we call, a society that gives you opportunity based off of your effort. So much of that message has been inundated in this country's fabric from the very outset. It's hard for folks who have that privilege and blinders to see that this is a society that does not give the same opportunities to non-white folks that it gives to white folks. And so people oftentimes, white people in particular, get very angry by this notion of white privilege. We'll say things like, I don't benefit from privilege, or I work hard for what I've gotten. Part of what we have to help folks understand, you can work hard and have privilege. It's just that your hard work will take you farther than folks who are not white who don't have that privilege. So to me, the Bill Barrs of the world, I wouldn't go to them to ask them about systemic racism because they don't see it. They don't know it. They don't understand it because it's been normalized to them. Talk to non-white folks about systemic privilege. Talk to non-white folks about how we have to work twice as hard, 3 times as hard to get half as far. Talk about the wealth gap in this country. Talk about about the incarceration rates of folks in this country. Talk about who has access to high quality medical care in this country. The list goes on and on to show how we have legislated systemic racism in this country. So again, it's like talking to the winners who had an advantage in the 100-yard race. They start at the 70-yard mark. We start at the beginning. They win the race, and we say, was there an advantage? They say, no, they ran hard for 30 yards, but not recognizing that they had a significant head start.
And I hear what you're saying, Dr. Howard, and it's so interesting because I'm writing a new book. And it's about race. And I was sending out my proposal to I'm trying to get a new agent, had a couple in the past, wanted someone new. And this white man responded to the proposal of the book saying, Areva, don't talk to Black people about race. They already get it. You want to talk to white people about race. And if you want to talk to us about race, you can't start with the premise that racism is systemic because you're going to lose us. So if you want to talk to us white people about race, you've got to slowly bring us along. You got to make us feel comfortable before we can have this conversation because we don't necessarily, well, he didn't say necessarily, we don't agree with you that this is systemic. And we're tired of really talking about this race issue and the media blowing it up. You have any solutions for us? So I'm listening to you saying, don't ask Bill Barr. I'm thinking about this white man who's telling me, stop talking to you about race because you're just going to see the problems. And I need to be talking to Bill Barr, but I can't talk to Bill Barr really about race. I got to, get him on my side. I got to talk to him about the weather or something else to make him like me enough to then maybe gradually talk to him about race. So, and I say that I'm kind of being tongue in cheek, but this is a white man who has a lot of power. He controls what books get written, not all books in the world, but he does have some degree of power. So those are the people that are making decisions about what gets disseminated into the world. And that is their thinking. So how do we get to that person? Because that's the same person that's in Florida. That's the person that's in Georgia that is enacting these laws that prohibit schools from teaching about race so that this white shooter has no concept of what Dr. Pizzella is talking about, that this is historical.
So this is white fragility at its finest, what you just described, Areva. And what white fragility says is that for many white people, the conversation around race, racism, and systemic racism is just so difficult to digest. So the default is sort of slow down. I don't have the ability to comprehend what you're saying, or can you give it to me in small chunks and bites? Or, you know what, just thinking about this makes it overwhelming for me, or I get emotionally drained. All these defensive mechanisms become a way to not engage in conversation about race. That's what fragility does. Robin DiAngelo's talked about the fact that most whites just don't have the stamina to talk about issues of race. So that I say, well, if you don't have the stamina to talk about it, to have a discussion about it, what do you think Black folks have had to do to deal with it for the last 400 years, right? So I think we have to continue to have the conversation, even though it makes folks uncomfortable, even though it makes folks uneasy, even though it's going to make folks feel somewhat resistant, because again, you can't engage in the discussion, but you expect us to live with it every day. That's why I think education is so important, Areva. I think in some ways, we are better off trying to invest in the next generation of judges and CEOs and publishers and folks who will control media, because I'm hopeful, some might call it naively optimistic, that young people today have much more openness and much more willingness to think about issues of race and racism and structural historical racism in ways that this current generation does not. I watched during the racial reckoning the number of young white teenagers who were out marching, protesting. I'm a college professor. I watched the number of young white college students who said they had come to Jesus meetings with their parents and grandparents about issues around racial awakening. I have to be hopeful that if we can be much more transformative with the next generation of future leaders who are going to occupy powerful spots, that we can then move the needle. I'm just not convinced that folks who are in positions of power today, who have benefited from privilege for 2, 3, 4, 5 decades, are going to just wake up one morning and say, you know what? Yep, I've had privilege, I've benefited, and now I've got to find ways to dismantle it. I'm just not hopeful that that's going to happen.
Yeah, it's interesting because as this story continues, I told someone about this guy, and I called him a white supremacist or made reference to him having white supremacist tendencies. And she said, oh, he's not a white supremacist, he's a grandfather. I said, okay, exhibit A, he's a grandfather. That is so out of touch with where this world is. And being a grandfather, he has bought into that privilege that you talk about. So yeah, so much work to be done. Quickly, Professor Pizzella, Dr. Howard just said there were so many white kids out marching. We saw them all with our very eyes after George Floyd was murdered. But we also saw, white folks went back to work. They went back into their homes. They left the streets. They left they left the protest. Are you at all hopeful that this kind of horrific shooting that we saw in Buffalo will cause there to be, because we haven't seen it yet, are we going to see white folks rise up again and stand in solidarity with black folks around these issues? Because what we've seen is kind of a retrenchment that has happened after, people say, well, COVID's over, BLM is over, everything's kind of over, let's get back to business as usual.
Well, if we're going to rely on history and we look at the cycles of history, not hopeful at all. But to Professor Howard's point, I think that we are inspired by the sentiments and the movement of youth. I think education is the key. We're having conversations with John Jay about issues of race, even though we do have another segment of faculty who don't really want to talk about it. One of the things, to Professor Howard's point is that you need to talk with Black people about issues of race. I'm a golfer and I'm a fisherman. No less than 4 times last year, and I go out in Forest City, Maine, and I'm, with some white friends, and invariably they get to this question, Frank, what's going on with this critical race theory thing? And I kind of laugh and I say, here we go. You know what I mean? Then I go on to explain this. No, it's not an effort to make little white kids feel bad about themselves. It's an attempt to explain the dissension that we have between race today. You only have to look at history to understand. If we want to understand where we're at, we need to understand where we came from.
Right.
And when I put it like that, they begin to get it. But to Dr. Howard's point, you really do have to talk to Black people and to really kind of get understanding. I'm afraid that the media obscures what critical race theory is all about. Critical race theory, as a name, has went by way of affirmative action. To almost suggest that it's something less than something that's not good. So I don't call myself a critical race theorist, but I'm always talking about race. If race is not included in every one of my classes, then you're not doing the job. In fact, I've even went as far as to say that at the NYPD Academy, they need to discuss race. They need to include courses about race, especially in a place where, in a city where Blacks are so prominent. So I'm inspired by some of the new police. Many of the students from John Jay go on to become police officers, and if they can go with that mantra, to kind of that race is an issue, then I think that there's some cause to be optimistic.
Just lastly for you, Dr. Howard, real quickly, tell us the replacement theory that we're talking about so much now because it was in that manifesto used to be this fringe concept that has now moved mainstream. Give us that history of it moving from the fringes to becoming mainstream. And did you say that replacement theory in some form is being taught in schools? Did I hear you say that?
No, I'm not saying it's being taught in schools. What I'm saying is that I don't see the uproar that critical race theory has. Critical race theory was not being taught in school, but folks showed up en masse to protest it. But if you understand great replacement theory, really has its roots going back to the 19th century in Europe. And there was concerns/fears then that darker hues of Europeans were coming to take over parts of Europe. And so it's been fringe for at least over 100 years. But in the last decade or so, it's become more prominent here in the United States, where there's the same concern. Here's the reality, Areva, you know this. We are witnessing unprecedented demographic changes in our country. And what we're seeing, and our schools reflected, is that we are enrolling more non-white students in schools than white students. So that means that by the year 2042, by some accounts, we will see a country, the United States of America, that will be majority non-white. That is something I think we should be proud of. We should embrace and celebrate our diversity. But if we're just being frank here, it scares the living daylights out of a lot of folks, especially those on the far right, because there's a fear that we are going to be outnumbered. There's a fear that they, folks of color, are going to take over. It's a fear that they're going to, let's be frank for a second, do to us possibly what has been done to them for centuries. And so that's what the fear is rooted in. So when you think about replacement theory, it's this sort of racist sort of concoction that somehow elite Jewish people have sort of constructed or socially engineered a way to have white people being replaced by non-white people, steeped in racism, hate, fear, anxiety, you name it. But at the end of the day, we are seeing it becoming more and more mainstream now, where you have far right-wing analysts, far right-wing media who are adopting this and saying, look, wake up, white America. These people are coming to take over. They're using critical race theory. They're using other things. And if we don't do something, they're going to take over our country. That was the whole mantra behind Make America Great Again, as if it was ever great for Black folks and folks of color in the first place. So I think there's a real tension, a real racial awakening in this country where we're seeing a significant shift. And let's be frank, folks who have been a majority for over centuries in this country are not going to take kindly to the fact that they will be the so-called minorities now and not non-white folks.
Yeah, so much to talk about. Thank you so much. Got to have you both back. Really interesting conversation. We're out of time now. Again, Dr. Tyrone Howard at UCLA has written a book, Why Race and Culture Matter in Schools. And Dr. Frank Pizzella has a book out called The Measurement of Hate Crimes in America. Thank you both for joining me for this really important conversation. I don't know what to say. I'm sure we'll be talking to each other again. Hopefully it won't be under such similar circumstances. Continue, obviously, to pray for those families who lost loved ones in this horrific mass shooting, and continue to pray for our country that we do wake up, because I don't know how many times we can have these wake-up calls and continue not to wake up. Again, thank you both for joining me. I want to thank all of my guests this morning. This is such a difficult conversation to have, and seemingly we keep having it over and over again because these mass shootings just keep happening, whether it's, again, a school or a mall or a movie theater. We just keep ignoring the fact that there are young white men out there who are in training. Let's call it what it is. They are in training. They're being inspired. Dylan Roof inspired this shooter. This shooter is going to inspire the next shooter. And until this country really wakes up, we're going to continue to be here. And thoughts and prayers, come on. Everybody's sick and tired of that. And I know the victims' families don't want to hear our thoughts and prayers. They want to see action that's going to save the lives of people so that we don't keep repeating this same cycle. You notice I haven't called the name of the shooter. I refuse to do so. He wants to be a hero. He wants to be a public figure. He wants to be a household name, and all of us have an obligation to make sure that doesn't happen. But I do, before I get out, just want to call the names of those people who lost their lives, because those are the true heroes, and those are the people that we should all remember. Aaron Slater Jr., Ruth Whitfield, Catherine Massey, Hayward Patterson, Pearlie Young, Roberta Drury, Celestine Cheney, Marcus Morrison, Andre McNeil, Geraldine Talley. All of those individuals who lost their lives. Let's pray for their families. Let's pray for the healing of this nation. And let's pray that this is a mass shooting that will cause our country not just to pray, but to take action. I'm out, y'all. Be safe out there. Remember, we're all in this together.